So today we're going to test a little bit about wideporting, which is the idea of having two SAS connectors going from the HBA and the file server to our JBOD. And so let's start, let's look at the SAS controller, and we can do -o and test ls all, and the controller is number 0. And we can see that, sure enough, it only has one cable plugged in. So the first 4 links are negotiated at 6 gigabits per second. And the next 4 are not plugged in. So we have just one cable going to the JBOD. I think our disks are the same. Yep. So we have the 16 disks. If we do zpool status, this is just a simple RAID 0 array. So about as fast as it's ever going to get. Just 16 disks and a nice RAID 0. And what we can do is we can... Let's start up here. We can run a command. FIO as a little tool for benchmarking. It's a little easier to use than DD. In this case, it's going to read 3 32 gig files basically as fast as it can. Block size is set really high. So this is really a good indication of the maximum sequential local read rate we're going to get out of the array. And I also have caching turned off. So we have we can show that here by doing ZFS get primary cache, and it's set to metadata. So we have caching turned off, because if you leave caching on, of course, the entire thing's pulled out of RAM. So we have the caching turned off, so we get a good idea of the actual speed of the drive. And let's execute that and let it run and see how fast we can pull data from the hard drives over a single 4 SAS link. Okay, and there we are. So we got 1.9 gigabytes a second, almost 2, which is about what I expect with this single 4-lane SAS going to the JBOD with 16 SATA disks. And I've ran it a couple times and the numbers never change. It's about what you'd expect as to the sort of raw sequential read speed. And so we can pop over to the Windows environment. So this is a Windows server connected with 2 10 gig connections, so 20 gig total. And we can run these same Windows side tests. And we'll see how this works. I do have it set to synchronous only, so both the cache is turned off and we're forcing synchronous, so that you get a good idea of this sort of lower bar performance. If you leave the async on, then the rate numbers will of course look artificially really good, because it all gets cached in RAM before being written to disk. And so with syncing on, it has to write it somewhere. And so we're going to let this run and we'll see how it looks with the single SAS interface. Okay, we finished the testing here, and you can see we got 2.3 gigabytes a second of read speed, which is pretty darn good. And of course, the random I/O, we got 35 for the read and 12 for the write. And a reminder, this is in synchronous mode with no RAM caching, and of course, write speed was right around 1 gigabyte per second. And so this gives us kind of a ballpark to see if these numbers are going to change at all when we add the second wide port. So I'm gonna capture this real quick. Let's save this off to the side here so we can see it later. So we can compare it to the config with the wide port. So let's go plug in the second port on this server and see if we can get it to sync up. Okay, we came back from there. Let's take a look and see if it worked. Okay, so now we have all 8 lanes are negotiated at 6 gigabits a second. I didn't have to reboot the server, by the way. I just plugged in the extra cable, and the SAS controller and the SAS expander connected up, and now we have all 8 lanes. So we can do that same read test with FIO, and this will read those 3 32 gig files. Again, caching is turned off, so this is all coming from the drive. And we can already see a big improvement there. We're getting, what, 2.6, 2.7 gigabytes a second. So it was definitely limited before with the 4 lanes. So adding the wide porting option did a pretty good improvement in disk speed. It's interesting to note that we didn't get like double the disk speed, probably because the actual raw read speed of the drives combined isn't enough to saturate it. But we did get a pretty good improvement so far. So we'll see what this does as a final test. Yeah, 2.7 gigabytes a second versus 1.9 before. So that's a pretty significant increase in speed by just adding that second cable when I already had the slot on the controller and the slot in the JBOD. So a relatively inexpensive way to get more speed. Let's pop over to the Windows side and we'll start running the same test again. Now we may not see much difference here because we're probably going to be limited by the network connection from this box to the server because it's just two 10 gig network connections, so 20 gig total. And so a more interesting test would probably be to put in a 40 gig adapter in this machine and the server and connect them over 40 gig to see if we start to see a bigger difference there. But we will let this run and just kind of see how it compares when doing the wide porting. Okay, this completed testing, and so we can pull over the old test results here. And there we are. So the one on the left here, this is the with two cables, so 8 SAS channels versus 4, and you can see the read speed is similar, slightly faster actually with a 1 there. The random IO performance on the read is very similar. The write random performance, again, very similar. Peak rate performance is a little better there, so that may be because of the extra channels. But overall, the performance isn't significantly different. And this is an important lesson. And the reason it's not significantly different is that the performance of this test is limited by these two 10 gig network connections. So we're never going to get more than a little bit over 2.2 or 2.3 gigabytes per second because that's the network speed limitation. And so if, let's say, you had a file server and it had an HBA that has 1 port, and you're thinking, well, I should go out and buy a new HBA that has 2 ports so I can do wide porting, you wouldn't gain a whole lot in this case. If the 2 ports are sitting there, there's no reason not to do it. So if you have an HBA in a server and it has 2 external ports and your JBOD has 2 ports, there's no reason not to go ahead and connect up that second channel. Now, one thing is this is with a RAID 0 array, and in a RAID 0 array, the disk we're reading over the network is equivalent to the disk we're reading from the disk itself because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm going to run this test really quick again and just show you the results for setting it to RAID Z2, because in that case, the file server has to read from disk more than what it sends over the network. And so it's possible that we'll see a little bit of a difference there. So we'll take a quick look and see if RAID Z2 performance is any different. Okay, so I ran the test again, RAID Z2. This is the RAID Z2 with 3 VDEVs, and on the left is the 2 controller connections. On the right is just 1. And you can see that they're very, very similar. The 2 controller maybe has a slight advantage in the random writes, but it's a pretty small difference probably in the noise there. And if you're watching the test run, the limiting factor here is the network performance versus the ability to read and write drives. And so this kind of further examples that doing the wide porting is nothing wrong with doing it, but you're not going to get any big jump in performance if your limiting factor is your network connection to your file server as opposed to something else. Now, there are 2 more tests that would be really neat to see. 1 is scrubbing and 2 is rebuilding. And so I will do a different video where I will try both doing scrubbing with a relatively full array and also a rebuild from a faulted disk, because that might be one where the dual port or the wide porting would make a bigger difference, because it'll allow some of that bandwidth used by the server for the rebuilding to then still be able to do file sharing. So I'll do that test later on and see what kind of difference it makes. I think the big summary here is that, if you have the dual port card in your file server and your JBOD has dual ports, there's no downside to running the cable to both of them. If you only have a single port card in your file server, going out and buying a dual port card just to do the wide porting, probably not a huge reason to do that unless you have very, very fast network I/O. If you're running either 40 gig or 100 gig networking, then you probably will see a bigger difference there. And if your JBOD array is filled with SSDs, that's a whole different story, because there you probably will be far more limited by the bandwidth over the SAS connection. And we may do another test here. We're going to build an array here shortly to be more of a high performance SSD array for VMs. And while we're building that, we will test both the narrow port and the wide port and see what the differences are. And that's it for today.